Hello, everyone. My name is Julie Garden Robinson. I'm a professor and food and nutrition specialist here at NDSU. I'm also your host as we launch the 2026 Field to Fork season. This is brought to you by NDSU Extension through grant funding. This is the 11th year we've done the series, and we're really glad you registered and joined us today. We have archived all of the webinars from the previous years, and the link to all of those recordings is on our Field to Fork webinar page. In fact, we've had about 50,000 live and recorded views since we began the series. The next slide shows the upcoming webinars, and we hope you join us for these interesting topics as well. As I noted, this program is sponsored in part with grant funding from the USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service. And I will ask all of you to complete the short online survey that will be emailed right after today's webinar. And some special instructions. There's a drop-down menu, and it's a Qualtrics survey. Be sure that you choose February 11th, 2026 on the drop-down. Just click into that. And you also will have access to a printable certificate of participation if that helps you in some way or if you just want to display it proudly. As a thank you, I will be providing prizes to the lucky winners of the random drawings. Be sure that you put your complete address on the follow-up form because you're from all over the place, and include your name, of course, your city, state, and zip code, as well as your address. After the summer season, when you all have a chance to practice your gardening skills, we will send a brief follow-up survey to learn how you're doing. And the reason we ask you to fill out these surveys is to help us continue to get funding from our grant funders. And we also want to know how you're doing. And we collect your ideas for topics for next year. So again, welcome to today's webinar, and I am pleased to introduce Don Kinzler as our first speaker. So let me tell you a little bit about Don. Don is a native of Lisbon, North Dakota, and he graduated from NDSU with a degree in horticulture. He and his wife operated a garden center in Fargo for 25 years. Don is a lifelong gardener. He is our extension agent for horticulture in Cass County, located in Fargo, North Dakota. He writes 2 weekly newspaper garden columns, maintains a podcast and blog site, and has weekly radio programs on 4 stations during the growing season. He and his wife live in Fargo. Thank you, Don, for launching the 2026 series. And don't forget, if you have questions for Don, please post those in the chat, and I will ask Don the questions after he finishes talking.
Thank you, Julie. And it's a pleasure to be here as we talk about the fine art of planting. And now it's fascinating. If there was a secret handshake among gardeners, it would be all the little things that gardeners do in planting to make things successful. But the nice thing is gardeners don't hesitate to share all these secrets. And so today we're going to visit about kind of this secret handshake called how to plant things and have them succeed better. And planting does make all the difference. So we're going to talk about planting tomatoes, other vegetables, potatoes, melons, strawberries, rhubarb, asparagus, how to plant fruit trees, shrub type fruits. Now, each of these could probably be an hour-long webinar in themselves. But what we're going to do is talk about some of the finesses of how to plant these with better success. And so we're going to start with tomatoes, and tomatoes remain America's #1 homegrown vegetable. Now, I'm actually happy that you can't buy a decent tomato in the grocery store because that makes our home garden tomatoes all the better. So let's talk about planting tomatoes. First of all, you can certainly buy tomato plants to plant out into the garden, but many gardeners enjoy starting their own from seed. maybe there's a certain variety that they want that they maybe can't get the plants of. So starting seeds of tomatoes is very popular. So a little clue on starting tomatoes. They should be started in our area about April 1st. So we don't want to start too early or they get too spindly indoors. And also, instead of planting the seeds directly into the finished cell pack or pot, instead, start them in a seed tray and then transplant them, as I'm doing in the photo there, into their cell packs or in pots. Now, last year on the Field to Fork, so check out the archive, I did a whole session on starting seeds. So check that out. So as you're growing the seedlings, they grow well under lights, but keep the lights just a few inches above the plants so that they get good light, good stocky. So there's a few tips there if you'd like to start tomatoes from seed yourself. Um, so once you've got the plants that you've either started yourself from your own seed or you've gone to the garden center and bought plants, tomatoes should not be planted outside into your garden until the soil temperature is higher than 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, the reason for that is tomatoes are a tropical plant, native to the tropics. And if tomato plants are transplanted out into chilly soil, that shock can permanently cause tomato plants to be stunted, and they oftentimes will not come out of that shock. They'll be less than what they could be. So it doesn't pay to jump the gun too much on tomatoes. Wait until that soil temperature rises up. Soil thermometers are wonderful. Food thermometers could be used, but oftentimes they don't go down low enough to monitor soil temperatures. As you notice, that soil temperature thermometer is in clear plastic. One way that we can increase soil temperature is by using clear plastic. I'm going to talk about that in just a few minutes when we're discussing melons. So next, as we're transplanting these out, one fascinating gardening term that we should be aware of is setting out. Someday I'm going to write a whole book on gardening terminology because some of these terms aren't always intuitive, especially for people that are just getting into gardening. For example, if an experienced gardener asks, well, when are you going to set out your tomatoes? Well, setting out is a time-honored term for transplanting the plants out into the garden. So let's talk about a few tips about setting out tomato plants into the garden. Well, first of all, it's a good idea to remove the lower leaves and then plant deeply. In a minute, I'll tell you why. So plant deeply up to their ears. Now, old Professor Neil Holland, who was the tomato breeder at NDSU, he introduced me to that term when he said, make sure you plant them up to their ears. In the meantime, I've been asked, well, what do you mean? Where are the ears of a tomato? Okay, well, if you planted me up to my ears, most of me would be down below soil, and also would be sticking out would be kind of the top part of my head. So same thing with tomato plants. The reason we do that is tomatoes are unique in that they will root along, excuse me, tomatoes will root along the buried stem. And so if you see in the picture on the right hand there, even the tomato part that's above soil is trying to send out roots. And so if we bury the stem, it will coax it to produce good roots. And the more roots that we have, the better the tomato is going to be. More roots, it'll be a more productive tomato plant. Also, by planting that tomato deeply, it will be less whippy and wimpy in the wind. Now, in the photo on the left, you'll see a kind of a taller tomato plant. And a customary way of planting tall tomato plants is to lay them down in a trench like this. and just bend them up gradually, being careful not to kink or break the stem so that just the top is above soil line. They will root all along that stem and produce a good plant. Uh, a person could conceivably dig a deep hole down in and plant that, but we mentioned that tomatoes like warm soil. And if you dig too far down in, that soil may still be cold in the spring. So a tall tomato plant is better laid in a trench and then covered over. Here's some tomato plants. Well, they're probably planted too closely. And also, those tomato plants planted high up out of the ground, boy, just feature one of our winds coming along. That is going to be very hard on those tomatoes. So instead of that, let's plant those tomatoes right up to their ears, where that red arrow is pointing. So see if we removed maybe that lower, some lower leaves there. These tomato plants are quite large, so maybe lay them in a trench and they'll root all along there. That tomato plant is going to be much happier than planted the way it currently is shown. After we've got our plants installed, at a certain point, it really helps to mulch that. Mulch is one of the single most important ways that we can fight blossom end rot, which is that black and sunkening lesion that tomatoes can oftentimes get. But we could spend a whole hour on blossom end rot itself. But one of the ways to prevent that is mulching. But the wisdom of old gardeners, I gardened with my mom since I was about 5 years old, and we always put straw on our tomatoes. Once when I suppose I was in high school, I asked mom, well, uh, we just planted our tomatoes. Why don't we put the straw on now? It would be easier. That's probably the end of May. It would be easier to get the straw around the tomato plants now when they're young. And my mom said, no, you can't do that. The soil is still warming up. If we put straw on too early, it will insulate the soil and keep it chilly, and the tomatoes won't grow as well. So mom always said, we need to wait until the end of June until that soil is warmed up and then put your straw on. Untreated straw or untreated grass clippings. Now let's talk a little bit about planting tips for other vegetables. Now this is a picture of our own garden. No, we don't have 10 kids, but I just enjoy planting vegetables. So we plant a little bit of everything. So let's talk a little bit about some of the planting tips for other types of vegetables other than tomatoes. Now, those of you that are longtime gardeners, this is probably going to seem like old hat, but for people that are just getting into vegetable gardening, um, it helps to know this. Okay, the importance of this slide is that some vegetables are started by planting seeds directly out into the garden soil. Other vegetables, we set out transplants or starter plants. Now, the interesting thing is when you visit a seed rack, the cabbage seeds are right beside the carrot seeds. Carrot seeds we plant directly out into the garden. Cabbage seeds, if you planted those directly out into the garden, you may never get a head of cabbage because they take too long of a season. So that's why some vegetables are started just directly planted out from seed. I mentioned the carrots. So radish, carrots, peas, beans, lettuce, beets, sweet corn, all are planted directly from the seed pack right out into the garden soil. Other vegetables, because they take a long season, are planted rather than direct seeded to the garden. We plant out transplants or starter plants. I already mentioned tomatoes. Peppers are the same way. The cabbage family, broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, those are all done by planting out transplants. That gives them a good head start so that you'll get produce by the end of the season. Now, certain vegetables you can either direct seed out into the garden soil or you can do transplants. In that either or group are things like squash, pumpkins, cucumbers, melons. For example, cucumbers. You could start your own plants early from seed. It only takes about 2 or 3 weeks in starting those indoors, and you've got a nice transplant you can plant out. That gives you an earlier crop of those, same as squash, pumpkins, melons, or you can just plant direct seed them out into the garden and you'll get a fine crop too, just maybe a little bit later. Now, let's talk a little bit about transplants, the starter plants. Either you've started your own or you've gone to the garden center and bought starter plants. So when we pop them out of the little cell packs, as we see over on the left-hand side, um, they're usually all root bound, and that's fine. There's only so much space for the roots to go, so they all circle around. So the question is, should you disturb those roots or should you just plant it as is? Well, oftentimes they do get planted as is and they seem to thrive. But I think it's valuable to tease those roots apart a little bit. On the right-hand side, you see a gardener there that's kind of unwinding some of the roots. They don't always unwind quite that nicely. But on the photo on the left-hand side, I would just with one hand, with fingers, kind of loosen up the bottom of that a little, especially loosen it up a little bit. I think that helps the roots to go out into the soil better. So rather than disturbing them too much and breaking the roots, maybe loosen them up a little, I think is a good idea. So as we're transplanting our starter plants, firm the soil around them. Maybe leave a little bit of a depression around for holding water. So when you water, then it'll kind of go right down around the plant. Now, I mentioned the importance of planting tomatoes deeply. They're a little unusual. The other transplants of vegetables, we don't want to plant that deeply. Maybe just slightly deeper than they are in the cell pack. That gives them a little more support, but not deeply like you would tomatoes. It's interesting, peppers are in the same family as tomato, but if you plant a pepper as deeply as you would tomato, that pepper might rot. So tomatoes are the exception to that rule. Maybe when you've set out the transplants, you might opt to give them some starter type fertilizer. Starter type fertilizers are a weak fertilizer that is immediately available to the roots and can boost them off, start the rooting, and get them off to a little head start. So another important part of planting technique is timing of when we're going to plant things out into the garden. That's an important technique. And the timing of planting depends on the type of crop. We can divide our vegetables into two groups, cool crops and warm crops. Some types of crops like it cool. They like cool weather. They'll germinate and produce well and grow well, start well in chilly soil. They'll also take some frost. On the opposite end of the spectrum are the warm-loving crops, tropical in nature. The warm crops, boy, if it tickles near frost, they can easily be killed, and they will not tolerate chilly soil. So when then can we start? If we're looking at gardening season, spring kind of starting in April, May, when can we get out in the garden and start planting? Well, the cool season crops, you can start sometime in April. Radish, onions, lettuce, spinach, peas, potato, carrots, the cabbage family, they like cool soil and they'll take a little bit of frost. So sometime in April is usually fine. The warm season crops. Those are the ones that even a little bit of chilly weather and that can set them back never to recover. So May 15th to the 25th. It does depend kind of on the area that you're in, but look at the frost date, the frost-free date, the best guarantee of a frost-free date. Now it's interesting. Sometimes if you jump the gun and plant too early with warm season crops, they'll languish in the chillier soil. So sometimes you're just as well waiting a little bit till closer 25th to 30th of May, and they might love that extra warmth and well surpass anything planted earlier. I'm sure many of us have heard parents and grandparents saying that they waited till Memorial Day to put in their gardens, and Memorial Day until 1968 was May 30th, and then they made it a Monday holiday, so it switched. So when our ancestors were talking about Memorial Day, they were talking the end of May, May 30th, for putting in gardens. Now, the next concept I want to talk about in planting that you encounter is the term planting in a hill. Now, when you look at a package of cucumber, squash, pumpkins, melons, they'll indicate how to plant, and it may indicate planting in a row with the seeds spaced every so far apart, but it may say, or you can plant them in a hill. Now, I was lucky. I gardened with my mom, and she told me, okay, we're going to plant the squash in a hill. And so I watched what she meant, planting them in a hill. And it's not creating a hill, a mound of soil. That's not what planting in a hill means. A hill is a kind of an old-fashioned term for planting in a grouping. So when mom said we're going to plant these squash or cucumbers in a hill, you planted a little grouping, 4, 5, maybe 6 seeds in a grouping, and then the next hill would be maybe 6 feet apart because these vining crops tend to take quite a bit of space. So the alternative to planting in a hill would be to be planting in a row, so space so far apart. So if you encounter the term planting in a hill, it doesn't mean you make a little raised mound. Instead, you're planting in a grouping. All right, let's talk about potatoes. Fun crop to grow. It's like digging buried treasure in the fall of the year. Important to use certified seed potatoes. Now, certified seed potatoes mean they come with a usually a blue tag on the package that indicates that uh, they've been certified and inspected to be free of diseases and to be high quality for using for planting. And of course, with potatoes, it's not actually a seed like a carrot seed. It's a piece of a potato. So when planting potatoes, depends on the soil a little bit, soil type as to how deep you go, but usually 3 to 4 inches deep is about the depth. And it's important as the potatoes are growing to remember to hill them up. There's that term hill again. And in this case, hill means something a little different. Hilling means that in potatoes means that you take dirt soil from in between the rows and pull it up around the plants when they're about 8 to 12 inches high. The importance of that is that it keeps the tubers farther down below surface. If you don't hill up potatoes, a certain percentage of the tubers form fairly close to the soil surface, and they can easily turn green and make them inedible. So hilling potatoes, commercial potato growers do that all the time. Hill up the plants when they're about 8 to 12 inches tall, and you can do that a couple of times through the season. Next, let's talk about melons. I love growing melons in our own garden. These are a couple of photos from our own garden. And they have, boy, a vine ripened melon is unbeatable in flavor. So let's talk about how to plant melons in our area. The best way to get melons to ripen well, especially if the season isn't chilly. If it's a hot growing season, they'll usually ripen up fine. But using clear plastic mulch. Now, this was based on research done at NDSU in the 1960s and 1970s on how could market gardeners get a crop of melons to ripen in our relatively short season. So they found that 2 things were important. You start seeds early indoors, around May 1st to the May 10th, somewhere in there, about 3 weeks before you plan to plant these out into the garden. So start seeds early. The second thing that the research found was the use of clear plastic mulch. Now, first of all, in the larger photo you see there, on the left-hand side, this was our own garden, left-hand side is a row of melons that the plants were started early and set out. The row of smaller plants to the right in plastic, those were direct seeded. I just planted some seeds down into the plastic. And you can see how starting plants early does give quite an advance. The muskmelons on the left are already producing blossoms. So it does give you a head start. Well, let's talk about this plastic mulch. Okay. Again, the photo to the left in our garden, the one row was planted directly out in the soil. The other row has clear plastic mulch. And the clear plastic mulch melons produced about, and this is about average, 2 to 3 weeks earlier than if you don't use the clear plastic mulch. Well, you might ask, well, wouldn't black plastic mulch, wouldn't that heat up even better? And the answer is no. The clear plastic mulch was shown to create a greenhouse effect over the soil. And so the greenhouse effect, clear plastic, lets the sunshine penetrate down and warms the soil just like a greenhouse. Black plastic, if used, the surface of the black plastic might get nice and warm in sunshine, but it doesn't allow that heat to go down and into the root zone area the way clear plastic does. Here you see in a high tunnel, they're kind of experimenting with different types of plastic, but you see that they're planting the plants down into slits cut into that plastic. As long as I'm mentioning planting melon plants, I mentioned on the other types of transplants to disturb the roots a little bit. Well, on melons, we don't want to disturb the roots a little. Melons and other members of that family, which include squash, so melons, squash, cucumber, zucchini, pumpkins, do not like to have their roots disturbed. So when you've got a melon transplant or cucumber transplant, take them gently out of their container and don't disturb the roots, but plant them down in. Here's a photo in our own garden of muskmelon that I've planted. You plant them in through an X-shaped slit, plant them down, and then fold those flaps down in and add soil around the plant so it holds that flap down. And maybe even give it a little starter fertilizer to get them off to a good start. So you might ask, well, how does water get down when you've got plastic over the root zone? Well, the water gets down through the hole in which you set the plants and also from the outer perimeter. Water gets to those plants just fine. Okay, next we're going to go to some planting tips for onions. There's a couple of options for how to start onions. One is the dry sets. Sets is the term for these little kind of dry bulblets that you see, oftentimes sold in mesh bags. So onion sets is one way to plant. On the right-hand side, you see onion plants. They're tied up kind of with a rubber band or twist them. And when you order onion plants from a mail order seed catalog, they'll probably arrive like that, or garden centers oftentimes have them. You can also start your own from seed in about February. I'm going to start my onion seeds any day now. There is an advantage to using onion plants, and that's because onion plants will usually give you a bigger bulb than the onion sets. Now, I grew up, my mom always used onion sets, so that's the way I had always done it. But then, count the day lost, you don't learn something new. A number of years ago, I learned that the onion plants will give you bigger onions. So why not? I like bigger onions, so I've gone to using onion plants instead of the dry sets. And you can start your own, as I mentioned, indoors and just kind of an open tray of seeding type mix. The seed should be started in February. So you can produce your own onion plants, and then those will be transplanted out in the spring. Onions can take chilly soil, so even in April. Next, we're going to talk about some of the perennial vegetables and fruits, things that come back each year. An important term to know that we're going to talk about here is the crown of a plant. Where is the crown of a plant? The crown of a plant is that area between the stem and the roots. And this is going to be key for how deeply to plant some of those. So the crown is where that blue arrow is showing on that strawberry plant. The crown is that region right between the leaves and stems and the roots. It's that area. So let's talk about strawberries. Well, when you're shopping for strawberries, there's two different categories, and we could talk for days on strawberries, but there's generally two different types. One class is called June bearing. You get one large crop in June and early July. Or there's the ever-bearing day-neutral types that give you a smaller crop in June and again in late summer. Well, regardless of which type that you've selected, there are two planting options, two starting options. You can order from seed catalogs and online. You can order bare root plants. They'll usually come in bundles of 10 to 25, all fastened together like you see in the photo there. That works well. Or garden centers oftentimes sell them already started for you in packs or pots. And both can work very, very well. The planting depth on these is critical. The crown, that's the spot with the yellow area, the crown needs to be at soil level. The photo on the right there kind of shows too, the crown should be at soil level or just slightly above. If you're planting them too deeply, it can adversely affect the growth of strawberries. There you see a nice strawberry patch. There are different ways of planting strawberries. University of Minnesota has a good site. NDSU has a good site. Simply search planting strawberries. You'll have a whole wealth of information. Generally, they get spaced about 12 to 18 inches apart. There's different planting methods too. For ever-bearing types, you usually remove the blossoms until about July 1st. The June-bearing types, according to NDSU recommendations, the June-bearing types, you don't let those fruit the first year. You're looking at the second year to get the good crop. And so they're indicating on June-bearing types to remove the blossoms and suckers that first year. Okay, next let's talk about raspberries, some planting techniques. Again, the options can be bare root plants or the potted type plants that are already growing. It's important when you're planting raspberries to prune the canes. The canes are the branches of a raspberry. Prune the canes back to 6 inches above soil level on those. That will help encourage the branching down at the base. The distance apart on raspberries should be about 3 to 4 feet. Raspberries are deceptive. When you're planting that little stick, it's deceptive because raspberries sucker nicely. And so by planting 3 to 4 feet apart, you're going to have a bunch of nice sucker growths coming up. They're going to fill in that area. And then you keep them in that nice, neat row. You'll probably have to remove as they want to sucker out and make that width too wide. And so some planting tips on raspberries. Next, we move on to asparagus, some techniques for planting. Also, two starting options. One is the bare root, and the other is the potted type that you might find at garden centers. The bare root is probably the better. From the garden centers or the mail order catalogs, you'll oftentimes find them termed 2-year crowns, a nicely established root system that you see. Asparagus is interesting for planting. Now, this comes from a University of Minnesota planting photo. They've dug a trench about 10 to 12 inches, or if it's really heavy clay, maybe only 6 to 8 inches, but lay the roots down like that in the bottom of the trench from head to toe so that the top buds are maybe a foot apart, and then cover with 2 to 3 inches of soil. Then okay, so we've gotten them down, kind of planted quite deeply. Then, as the asparagus starts to grow, you keep adding a couple inches of soil until it's flush across the top. What that does is it gets that roots down deeply. You know, if I'm only planting a couple of asparagus plants, well, I'll just dig a deep hole. Asparagus doesn't mind chilly soil, so I can dig a deep hole on that. Rhubarb. What would our yards be without rhubarb? The nice thing about rhubarb is it can become a heritage plant that you pass along from generation to generation. I got my rhubarb from my mom's place, their home where she had it forever. She got it from her mother on their farm, and she had had it forever. So if you're digging and dividing an existing rhubarb plant, you can do it Labor Day or early spring. Early spring, just as they're starting to emerge from the ground, is the time to dig and divide, or wait until fall. So if you're planting a new rhubarb patch, you can again go bare root. Rhubarb, rhubarb roots and starts are ugly. Now sometimes what you'll get from a mail order catalog, and it's fine, on the left hand side is just this chunk. And hopefully they've sprouted so you can kind of tell which end is up, or potted plants. With the rhubarb, the planting depth again is important. So we find the crown. So on some of these big clumps, you might have to kind of look for the old leaves and kind of see the root remnants so you can tell which end is up. The crown of rhubarb should be about 2 inches below soil surface on rhubarb. Let's talk about fruit trees. It's important on fruit trees, very important. Again, two starting options. Some places sell bare root trees, others sell potted. Let's talk about planting the bare root. And this is vital. Okay, on a bare root fruit tree, such as apples, plums, or others, look for the flare root. The bottom part of a fruit tree trunk kind of flares outward a little bit. And so look at for the flare root. That's the first large root coming off of the stem, the trunk, where the yellow arrow is. That flare root should be just below soil surface. So locate the depth of your hole so that in the final planting, that flare root, the first big root, is only just below. The reason I emphasize this is if any trees are planted too deeply, in 10 to 15 years, they can die from that. We've done a lot of postmortems on trees that have just all of a sudden died, and planting depth is very, very important. Now, the graft knob, that's that dog leg on fruit trees. That graft knob should be above soil, and the flare root is going to be below soil. Okay, what if you've opted for potted uh, apple trees or fruit trees? And these are common at garden centers. You can't assume that you should plant a potted tree at the same depth that it's planted in the pot. And here's why. Many of the fruit trees are planted too deeply in the pot. The reason that garden centers sometimes do that is to keep them from tipping out of the pot quite so much. If you see in that red circle, they've scraped away soil to look for that flare root that I talked about in the bare root. That flare root, when you plant this potted tree, that flare root in the final planting needs to be just below soil surface. So in a container grown, a potted tree, you might need to scrape away some of that top. For example, in this potted tree, if you look at the distance between the thumb and the little finger, that tree was planted in the pot probably 6 inches too deep. That's deep enough to kill that tree. So if you assume that you can plant it at the same depth it is in the pot, you could be vastly wrong. Instead, plant it so that that flare root is just below soil surface, and then that tree is going to be happy. When you take trees out of a pod, the roots just naturally circle around. And if we plant it as it comes out of the pot, again, that can cause death of a tree in 12 or 15 years. So, very important to cut away the bottom and the outer perimeter. As you see there, the saw is being taken to the bottom and to the outer perimeter to saw away. Person might ask, well, could we just kind of pull out those roots and tease them outward? Well, you might be able to, but it's awfully hard to get those roots to come outward. And so again, the current recommended practice is to take that knife or saw and shear off that outer perimeter. Very important to keep the roots moist of a tree. If it's a bare root tree, keep them in a plastic bag with some moist covering around them, because roots exposed to soil can die within seconds. And so on a hot sunny day, while you're digging the hole, and if you've got the bare root tree just kind of sitting there, it could be dead and you don't even know it yet. So very important. Or when you're sawing away on the roots of a potted tree, make sure that you kind of either keep it covered or moist or do the operation very quickly so that those roots don't become overly dry. So cover the area with plastic or mulch or something. When you're planting a tree, should you amend the soil? Give it some good extra stuff, peat moss, compost? And the answer is no. If we create a designer soil down in there, those roots are never going to want to leave home and they need to go out into the native soil. And so simply backfill with native soil, water it in well to settle the soil immediately. Now we're going to finish up with shrub type fruits. That could be aronia, honeyberries, juneberries, elderberry, currants, gooseberries, lots of selection. Again, some nurseries sell them bare root. Others sell them potted. Both work. With those, locate the final product so that the crown, that's the area between the stems and the roots, locate that just slightly deeper than the soil level on those. Well, there we did it. Look at that. Our apple tree is bearing fruit, and we did it. So all of these little planting tips. So I've come to the conclusion that success with plants really means doing seemingly small things with determination. And that's what makes our planting so successful. If you have any questions, in a minute we'll address the questions that were in the chat. But if you have any other questions beyond what we talk about, feel free to email me. My email address is donald.kinzler@ndsu.edu. All right. And now I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Julie, let's address the questions.
You have lots of questions, Don. First, what is the growing zone in Fargo?
The growing zone in Fargo, we've warmed up. Since I was a boy, we always used to be zone 3, and that's what I learned. But warm temperatures have moved northward. Fargo is in zone 4. The northern tier of counties across North Dakota and Minnesota are still zone 3. There's zones A and B also on those, but generally tags of plants just list the number without the AB. So Fargo zone 4, across the upper tier of counties, zone 3.
And I'll encourage everybody who's not from North Dakota on this call, you all have cooperative extension in your states. And they all have specialists in gardening and so on. So for very specific questions for your plants that you grow, I'd have you check that out. You're certainly welcome to check out all the resources. I'll do a quick ad here. We popped in the website for Field to Fork, and that covers apples to zucchini and everything in between. So there's a windbreak cookbook with all kinds of tree growing information, garlic, an orchard to table guide, and a lot more. We had another question here. Does it matter what lights you use when starting plants?
Oh, you've got good choices. Shop type fluorescents, 2 tubes, a warm white, cool white. Those work well. Regular LED shop type lights, those work well. Or it can be special plant lights. I've grown most of my seedlings forever, first under fluorescents, then I switched to just LED white type tubes. In our back room at the office here, I've got some experimenting with some purple lights and other regular LED plant type lights. So you've got a lot of choices there. It does not need to be special plant lights.
And I'll guide you to another resource. Last year, the 2025 Field to Fork webinar series featured the science behind indoor plant lighting. So if you check that, you'll be able to watch a whole webinar.
That is a great resource. She did a wonderful job of going through all the different types available.
Another question, why not plant tomatoes into a cell pack? What's the advantage of starting them in a starter tray?
Again, watch the whole field of fork from last year in which I addressed that. But there's a benefit of starting them in a seed tray, taking each one out and transplanting them in, and that's the way the greenhouses do it. So if there was a shortcut on direct seeding, the greenhouses would be doing it. But that transplanting method imparts a transplanting vigor. You can set that little seedling down a little bit deeper so it's less wimpy, and it makes a much better plant. So in a nutshell, it works much better. And that's the customary way in greenhouses instead of direct seeding into the cell packs.
So what is the trick in not breaking the tomato stem when bending the stem when planting the plant?
Oh, experience is the best teacher because I've broken lots of tomatoes when I've not gently curved them upward because they can be kind of brittle. So the trick is when I'm laying the tomato in the trench. Okay, start laying it in the trench, and then with my other hand, I bring a little scoop of soil underneath to support where the stem starts to go upward. Okay, so you're putting a little bit of soil support under that, and it gives it just enough support. And then when you fill it in, it's less apt to kink and break.
Great, thank you. A couple questions about mulch. Can you use shredded paper as mulch?
As long as it's just not colored paper, shredded. Most inks now are soy based, and paper is a good mulch. And so shredded paper works very well for mulch. Person needs to, once it kind of gets wet down and kind of crusty, then it's less apt to blow.
Here's a question. My dad has his lawn sprayed 4 times a year from a company. It's fertilized and weed treated, I believe. Can I use that grass to mulch?
uh, uh, Clippings from herbicide treated lawns can cause a lot of problems in vegetable gardens. If it was a one-time herbicide application, the customary recommendation was to wait 3 mowings, dispose of those, and then the next mowing should be safe. But when lawns are being treated more often with herbicide, I would not use those in the vegetable garden. And so again, it's a very good mulch, but the chances as oh, I was also going to mention some of the herbicides being used now are quite potent, and they have a longer residual. So in a lawn that's being have herbicide applied 4 times during the growing season, I would hesitate to use those.
Question about kohlrabi.
Thanks for being cautious on that, by the way, because it's much better to be proactive instead of wishing that one hadn't.
How's kohlrabi started? Can it be grown from starters, or how do you start some kohlrabi in your garden?
2 ways. Kohlrabi grows fairly rapidly, so I grew up just seeding those directly out into the garden, and that works well. Or garden centers also have little packs of plants, 4 pack, cell pack of kohlrabi already started, and that gives you kohlrabi earlier. But they will ripen in plenty of time, even if you direct seed them into the garden.
Excellent. Usually, a plant will state on the package there's X number of days until it's ready. Do you subtract the days it was a transplant?
That's a great question because, for example, if a tomato, in the seed catalog, if it indicates that it's a 75 day and you started it 30 days ahead, does that mean you're going to get tomatoes in about 45 days? And no, the days to maturity on vegetables that are customarily set out as plants, that's the length of time, kind of on average, from the time you would transplant plants into the garden, not from the date that they were seeded. So a 75-day tomato, on average would be 75 days to first fruit from the time it's transplanted into the garden.
Another couple questions about compost. If you get compost from the city, how long should you wait to use it? Or how about if you get compost from a tree service?
Compost from the city collection sites is interesting because a lot of what goes into that compost is from lawns. And there's always a risk that a lawn's treated with herbicide, those clippings could end up in that compost. And some herbicides with a long residue have been known then in city composts to cause problems in vegetable gardens. There is a bean test. So if you're wondering about compost, it's probably a good idea to do the bean test. In a nutshell, that's you take a pot of soil, do more than one pots of soil, and then plant about three string bean seeds in it. String beans are very sensitive to herbicide, and see if those beans grow normally. Or if they come out all gnarly, then it's an indication that there could be herbicide in. So using compost uh, from a municipal site can be a little bit of a roll in the dice. Rapid City a few years ago had to discontinue giving out their whole mountain of compost because it had enough herbicide tainted in it. So testing it, I think, is a good idea before one were to use it wholesale on a vegetable garden.
Next question. It's about clear plastic mulch. How do you control weeds that might grow under that mulch?
The weeds get solarized off. They will start under there because they got a good warm climate under there. So they will start and then pretty soon they get fried off. Um, Purslane that likes it warm sometimes will keep growing a little bit under there until it gets fried off. But weed control is not bad at all. Sometimes if a weed has bothered me under there until it gets fried off, I'll reach my hand under the plastic, pull out the weed, and then fasten the plastic down. But that's usually not necessary. Where clear plastic is used by melon growers, they're doing acres and acres of those and no need to do weed control, at least under the plastic, between rows, probably.
You had a couple questions about pruning raspberries. Should you prune them back every year? When should you prune them?
Yeah, raspberries, again, we could do a whole hour on that. The pruning is fascinating. It depends on the type of raspberries you have. Some are fall bearing, some are kind of ever bearing. And so generally, raspberries, each cane grows 1 year and then bears fruit the second year. So within a raspberry patch, you have canes that are going to be bearing and canes that are just 1 year not going to be bearing. So bottom line, bottom line is if you look in the spring of the year and you can notice the difference between kind of younger looking canes and old woody canes, cut out the old woody canes. Those would have borne fruit last year. They won't this year. And so take out those. Again, probably the best thing I could indicate would be just do a search pruning raspberries, University of Minnesota, or NDSU, and they've got some good pictorials on those.
You had another question about that clear plastic. That has everybody thinking about it. Where do you get it?
I buy it from the farm supply store. It should be at least 4 mil thick. The plastic that's used, sold as painter's plastic, is only 2 mil thick. So I buy it it's actually about 10 feet wide, but I cut it down to 4 feet and on big rolls. And so I buy it at the farm supply store and then just cut it to about 4 foot widths.
Another question just popped in about mulch. Um, what's the best place to get mulch?
Best place to get mulch. Well, for trees, I go to some of the local tree cutter downer people, tree removal services, I should say. And oftentimes they will, and sometimes it's for sale, and that's fine. It's a good product. And so for tree type mulch, I will do that. Otherwise, for garden type mulch, then straw, untreated grass clippings, shredded newspaper, cardboard weighted down. That's not maybe the prettiest mulch, but weighted down, even cardboard can be used. in a vegetable garden.
Is there a specific place we should look for getting straw that's safe to use in a garden?
Straw, it's interesting. Some of these products have become a little more complicated with herbicides that have long residuals. For example, straw, if some grains are treated with herbicide that has a long residual, sometimes that straw can continue to have that residue that then in turn would affect the garden on which we place that straw. So it's important to visit with the where you get that straw to see, did that have what type of herbicide might have been used on the grain, the wheat or barley from which it came. And there are organic sources of straw as well. But that is a factor each year of straw that has been used that is still carrying some herbicide residue.
Can pine needles work as mulch?
Yes, pine needles work excellent. You can buy bags of pine needle mulch. Sometimes there's a rumor that goes around that pine needles, evergreen needles, spruce needles will cause soil to become too acid. And no, although the evergreen needles might have a little acid in the raw product, as they break down, that acid breaks down, and there's not enough acid to adversely affect anything. Most of our soils across the upper Midwest could use, especially in North Dakota, could use a little acidifying. So pine needles make an excellent mulch.
Here's a good question. Does mulch have any effect on the nitrogen level of the soil? And
It
should we
can.
be removing these mulches in the fall?
It mulches can, if it's an undecomposed mulch, such as straw, grass clippings, as as it decomposes, the little organisms that decompose that, especially on the soil surface, they're also using nitrogen. So the very surface could have some nitrogen tied up. Eventually, that would be released. But most plant roots are down far enough, so I don't think the surface mulch would adversely affect the nitrogen content down below. Um, but if that undecomposed mulch was tilled into the soil, that could deplete some nitrogen for the next year. But the surface mulch shouldn't adversely affect the nitrogen during that first growing season, other than at the surface.
Well, we're almost at the end of our hour, but I have one more question. But before that, I want to thank you, Don, for all the beautiful PowerPoint that folks listening can download and look at more closely. It's on our website. Your final question is, how do you get rid of rust on rhubarb?
Rust on rhubarb. And that's typically a fungus type disease, which can disfigure both the leaves and the stems. And so the trick is to apply an all-purpose vegetable fungicide, but it needs to be applied as the leaves are and stems are just starting to emerge in the spring. So once that the rhubarb is already affected, it's too late for control. So if your rhubarb is year after year affected, as soon as it's starting to pop up, apply an all-purpose vegetable fungicide, and also good sanitation. In the fall of the year, after it's all brown and crunchy, remove those old leaves and stems.
Well, I'll draw us to a close. We couldn't get through all the questions because there are 320 of you on this, which we love. But I certainly invite you all to join us next week. We'll have Tom Kelb joining us, and he is a horticulture person out in Bismarck in the center of the state. And I'm sure he'll have an interesting talk as well. But thank you, Don, so much for putting in all the effort to make a beautiful presentation. And thanks to all of you for joining us.
Thank you all very much. It's been my pleasure.